On the northern coast of Egypt, where the desert reaches the Mediterranean, and the light seems to sharpen every edge of stone, there once stood a city built to rival the world. Alexandria. Founded in the name of a conqueror, enriched by merchants, governed by Rome, and haunted by the memory of its great library, it was a place where continents met. Greek philosophers walked beside Egyptian priests. Jewish scholars debated Roman officials. Christian bishops preached to crowds drawn from every province of the empire. Ships entered its harbor carrying wheat, ivory, papyrus, spices, soldiers, rumors, and ideas. For centuries, Alexandria had gazed outward, across the sea and upward towards the stars. But by beginning of the 5th century, the city itself was changing. The Roman world was no longer certain of itself. Old institutions endured, yet their foundations were weakening. Ancient gods still had worshippers, but Christianity now enjoyed imperial support. Bishops were becoming political authorities. Religious communities competed not only for souls, but for streets, buildings, privileges, and ultimately power. And yet Alexandria remained brilliant. But brilliance does not prevent darkness. Sometimes it makes the shadows deeper. And in this city, during one of the great transformations in human history, there lived a woman whose intellect commanded the respect of philosophers, magistrates, and even future bishops. Her name was Hypatia. We know the manner of her death. It has echoed across 16 centuries. But to remember only how Hypatia died is to repeat the injustice committed against her. Before she became a martyr, a legend, or a symbol, she was, first and foremost, a teacher, a mathematician, an astronomer, a philosopher, and one of the most remarkable public intellectuals of the ancient world. In order to better understand Hypatia, we must first understand her city. Alexandria was not a silent sanctuary filled only with scrolls and scholars. It was a vast imperial metropolis, crowded, wealthy, and ultimately politically volatile. The city was divided by language, by profession, by neighborhood, social rank, and religion. You had Greek, Egyptians, Romans, and Jews, which have lived there for centuries. Christianity, once persecuted, had grown into the most powerful organized force inside the city. Its bishops commanded loyalty far beyond the walls of their churches. Its monks could descend from the Egyptian desert in their hundreds. Its charitable fraternities cared for the sick and buried the dead, but could also serve as disciplined instruments of pressure in the streets. And the Alexandrian crowd was famous for its intensity. An insult could easily become a riot. A theological disagreement could become a struggle for control of a district. A rumor repeated often enough could become a death sentence. The Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, our most important near-contemporary witness to Hypatia's murder, wrote that the people of Alexandria were unusually inclined towards turbulence, and that their disputes seldom ended without bloodshed. This was the city in which Hypatia thought. A city where thought possessed prestige, but where prestige could become political. A city where philosophers advised governors and bishops contested the authority of imperial officials. A city where every public figure stood within the reach of admiration, envy, and accusation. Yet Alexandria was also one of the great intellectual centers of the Roman world. The original royal library had declined long before Hypatia's lifetime, but Alexandria's scholarly tradition had not disappeared. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, Textual criticism and philosophy continued to be taught. The city's intellectual life no longer depended upon a single building. Knowledge had dispersed into schools, temples, churches, private houses, and networks of teachers and students. It survived because human beings carried it. It was essentially a living library. It survived because somebody copied the manuscripts, because someone corrected the calculations, because someone taught the next generation how to understand what the previous one had discovered. Hypatia would become one of those guardians of knowledge. Not the final scholar of antiquity, not the sole defender of reason, but a formidable link in the chain of human knowledge, stretching backward towards Plato, Euclid, Apollonius, Diophantus and Ptolemy himself, and forward through generations she would never live to see. Despite all that, we cannot claim to know exactly when Hypatia was born. Some historians place her birth around the year 370. Others argue that she must have been born earlier, perhaps in the middle of the 1350s, because she was already an established teacher by the 1390s. The most honest answer is therefore a range. Hypatia was probably born sometime between about 1355 and 370. Uncertainty is not an embarrassment to history. It is part of the discipline itself. Where evidence is silent, serious historians must resist the temptation to fill the silence with certainty. What is beyond serious dispute is that Hypatia was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, one of the last important mathematicians associated with the city's ancient scholarly tradition. Theon studied and commented upon the works of earlier masters. His name is closely associated with the editions of Euclid and with the extensive commentary of the Almagest, the monumental astronomical work of Claudius Ptolemy. To a modern audience, commentary may sound passive. It was anything but. Ancient scientific texts were difficult, compressed, and vulnerable to corruption, as they were copied by hand. To preserve them required intelligence, precision, and generally good judgment. A commentator had to reconstruct arguments, correct numerical tables, clarify demonstrations, and train students to follow chains of reasoning that might extend across generations. Theon's house was therefore not merely a home. It was a workshop of civilization. Within it, Hypatia learned geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. She encountered a universe that could be described through proportion and motion. She learned that the apparent wandering of the planets could be represented mathematically, that the curve of a cone could produce an ellipse, a parabola, or a hyperbola, that numbers possessed relationships invisible to the eye, but discoverable by disciplined thought. And she learned something more important than any individual theorem. She learned that the human mind could impose order upon the complexity without destroying the mystery of the world. At some point, the student ceased merely to follow her father. She became his collaborator. One surviving title connected with Theon's commentary on Ptolemy refers to an edition prepared or revised with the assistance of my daughter Hypatia the philosopher. The precise meaning remains debated, but the title reveals something extraordinary. Hypatia was not remembered merely as a gifted daughter assisting a famous man. She had acquired a title of her own, the philosopher. Theon had opened the door to a world of knowledge, and Hypatia walked through it and became a master in her own right. By the final years of the 4th century, Hypatia had established herself as one of Alexandria's most respected teachers. Socrates Scholasticus wrote that she surpassed the philosophers of her time and succeeded to the intellectual tradition of Plato and Plotinus. Later sources describe her appearing publicly in the cloak worn by philosophers, explaining difficult ideas to those who came to hear her. This public presence mattered. The ancient philosophical teacher did not merely deliver information. Philosophy was understood as a way of life. Its purpose was to discipline the mind, restrain the passions, and guide the soul towards truth. Hypatia belonged to the tradition now called Neoplatonism. The name was invented much later. Hypatia herself would simply have considered her teaching to be Platonic. At the center of this philosophy was the conviction that reality possesses an intelligible order. She believed that beyond the changing material world lay eternal principles. Beyond multiplicity lay unity. Beyond confusion lay the possibility of ascent through reason, virtue, and contemplation. For Hypatia, mathematics was not separate from philosophy. Geometry trained the mind to recognize forms that did not decay. Astronomy revealed regularity within apparent disorder. The study of number prepared the intellect to rise from the visible world towards the invisible structure beneath it. This was not modern secular science confronting religion. Hypatia's universe was filled with the divine. Her philosophy sought not to banish transcendence, but to approach it through intellectual purification. That helps explain why Christians could study under her. Her famous pupil, Synesius of Cyrene, would eventually become a Christian bishop. Yet he never repudiated his teacher. His surviving letters are our most intimate evidence of Hypatia's life. In one, he writes of the woman who presided over what he called the mysteries of philosophy. In another, written in anguish near the end of his life, addresses her as mother, sister, and teacher. 3 words, but within them an entire relationship survives. Mother, because she had formed his character. Sister, because philosophy had created a bond deeper than distance. Teacher, because even after he became a bishop and public official, her intellectual authority still endured. Synesius and his fellow students appear to have regarded themselves as members of a philosophical family. They came from different cities and probably from different religious backgrounds. They studied together, debated together, and carried Hypatia's influence back into the wider empire. Some entered government, some entered the church, some became patrons and landowners. Through them, her classroom reached places she herself may have never visited. Cyrene, Constantinople, the provincial capitals of the Eastern Mediterranean. Her school was not simply a room in Alexandria. It was a network of educated human beings connected by loyalty to a woman whose judgment they trusted. And Hypatia's authority ended beyond scholarship. Synesius asked her to intervene on behalf of acquaintances whose property was threatened. Other sources suggest that civic officials visited her and sought her advice regularly. She moved among men who held office without surrendering the independence expected of a philosopher. This required courage. The Roman world did not prohibit every woman from education or public influence. Elite women could own property, finance institutions, and shape political decisions. But the recognized public role Hypatia achieved remained profoundly unusual. She did not command attention because the law had required men to listen. She commanded it because they believed she was worth hearing. Hypatia's philosophical reputation cannot be separated from her command of mathematics and astronomy. The historian Philostorgius wrote that she surpassed even her father, particularly in the area of astronomy. A later Byzantine encyclopedia, drawing upon earlier sources, credits her with the work connected to the 3 major areas of ancient mathematics: Diophantus and the study of numerical problems, Apollonius and the geometry of conic sections, and an astronomical canon, probably involving tables used to calculate the motions of celestial bodies. None of these works survives intact under Hypatia's name. This absence has invited both exaggeration and dismissal. Some have imagined discoveries for which no evidence exists. Others have treated the disappearances of her text as proof that she contributed little. Both reactions misunderstand the nature of ancient scholarship. Hypatia's work may have taken the form of commentary, revision, and teaching editions. She may have reorganized difficult materials so that the students could understand it easier. She may have corrected tables, clarified proofs, and preserved methods that otherwise might have vanished. Such work rarely produces the dramatic moment of a new law of nature, but civilization itself depends upon it. Discovery is only one part of knowledge. The other part is transmission. A theorem that no one can understand is as vulnerable as a manuscript consumed by fire. A calculation that is never checked becomes error, and a book that no teacher can explain becomes a silent project. Hypatia belonged to the class of scholars who kept knowledge alive by making it teachable. Consider the conic sections associated with Apollonius, for example. Take a cone and pass a plane through it at different angles. One cut produces a circle, another an ellipse, another a parabola, and another a hyperbola. These curves would later become essential to astronomy, architecture, optics, and physics. The planets themselves move in ellipses. Projectiles trace parabolic paths. Modern communications rely upon parabolic reflectors. Yet in Hypatia's world, the study of these forms was an act of pure intellectual discipline, an exploitation of the truths whose future applications no one, no matter how wise, could imagine. This is how knowledge often advances. One generation studies it because it wishes to understand, another inherits it to understand, and changes the world with it. Synesius would appreciate Hypatia for assistance with a scientific instrument described as a hydroscope, probably a device for measuring the density of liquids. The letter demonstrates that her expertise was not confined to abstract contemplation. She inhabited the border between mathematical theory and practical construction. She understood how numerical and geometric principles could become metal, balance, measurement, and instrument. Hypatia is sometimes credited with inventing the astrolabe. The claim goes too far, some would say. Astrolabe-like instruments existed before her, but her circle clearly possessed sophisticated knowledge of astronomical devices. An astrolabe, after all, allowed its user to model the sky, estimate time, and represent the positions of celestial bodies. Held in the hand, it was a miniature cosmos, a marriage between brass and mathematics. And perhaps this is the finest way to understand Hypatia's scientific world. Her entire life was spent under the same stars, under the same firmament visible to every sailor, farmer, and traveler. But she had learned to read them differently. Where others saw lights moving through darkness, she saw relationships, intervals, and cycles. Not because the stars had changed, but because the mind observing them had been trained. Hypatia's life unfolded during one of the greatest religious and political transformations in European and Mediterranean history. Christianity had begun as a persecuted faith, but by the end of the 4th century, it had acquired imperial favor and imperial dominance. This transition was neither immediate nor peaceful. Traditional cults did not disappear overnight. Christians themselves were divided by fierce theological disputes. Jewish communities remained influential. Philosophical schools continued to teach ideas rooted in the pre-Christian past. But the distribution of power was changing. Temples lost. Churches gained property. Bishops became negotiators, patrons, and political leaders. The language of salvation entered the struggle for civic authority. In 391, when Hypatia was probably already an adult, the Serapeum of Alexandria was destroyed under the episcopate of Theophilus. The Serapeum had been one of the city's most imposing religious complexes, dedicated to Serapis, a god whose cult blended Greek and Egyptian traditions. Its destruction was a declaration that the old religious order would no longer expect protection. Later, storytellers often connected this event to the final burning of the Great Library of Alexandria. The evidence does not support such a simple scene. The famous royal library had already suffered decline and dispersal across centuries. It is uncertain how many books, if any, remained in the Serapeum at the moment of its destruction. History does not require a single magnificent fire to explain cultural loss. Libraries can vanish through neglect. Institutions can die when funding ends. Knowledge can disappear one uncopied manuscript at a time. The destruction of the Serapeum did not extinguish ancient learning. Hypatia continued to teach for more than 2 decades. Christian scholars continued to study Greek philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. But the event changed the symbolic landscape of Alexandria first and foremost. It demonstrated that sacred buildings could be humiliated, that victorious communities could transform public space, that the memory of one world could be dismantled by the authority of another. Hypatia survived this transformation because she was not leading a militant pagan resistance. Her philosophy was intellectually rigorous but politically adaptable. Her Christian students did not consider learning from her an act of betrayal. She represented a form of cultural continuity capable of crossing religious boundaries. But she also represented something that increasingly stood outside ecclesiastical control. Her authority did not come from ordination. It did not come from imperial appointment. It came from reputation, education, and personal allegiance. She was an independent center of influence. In peaceful times, such figures enrich a city. In times of factional struggle, they can appear to be dangerous. And storm clouds were already gathering upon Alexandria's fair horizon. In October 412, Bishop Theophilus died. His nephew, Cyril, succeeded him as a Bishop of Alexandria after a contested and turbulent election. Cyril would later become one of the most influential theologians in Christian history. His arguments concerning the nature of Christ and the title of Mary would shape doctrine for centuries. But this early episcopate was also marked by confrontation. Cyril inherited an office that had become far more than spiritual. The Bishop of Alexandria possessed wealth, followers, charitable institutions, and enormous influence over the city's Christian population. The imperial prefect of Egypt. Orestes represented the emperor. He commanded the machinery of civil government, taxation, and law. Both men were Christian. This is an important fact. The conflict was not simply Christianity against paganism. It was a struggle between two forms of authority with an increasingly Christian empire. The bishop claimed moral and communal leadership. The prefect claimed imperial and legal jurisdiction. Alexandria had room for both offices. It did not easily accept two masters. Tensions escalated through disputes over public order. Violence broke out between Christian and Jewish groups. After a deadly attack, Cyril expelled many Jews from the city and their property was seized. Orestes objected and reported the situation to the emperor. Efforts at reconciliation failed. Then, according to Socrates Scholasticus, approximately 500 monks came into Alexandria from the desert of Nitria to support Cyril. They confronted Orestes in the street, and although the prefect publicly identified himself as a Christian, the monks accused him of paganism. One of them was a man named Ammonius, and he struck Orestes in the head with a stone. The prefect was wounded, and the crowd eventually drove the monks away, and Ammonius was captured, tortured, and killed. Cyril attempted to honor him as a martyr, but the claim did not convince everyone. Even many Christians recognized that dying after attacking a public official was not the same as dying for the faith. The evidence revealed how far the struggle had traveled from theological principle into urban intimidation. And it was at this moment that Hypatia became vulnerable. She maintained contact with Orestes. There is no evidence that she commanded his policies or dictated his opposition to Cyril, but she possessed what frightened political factions have always feared: access. Orestes trusted her enough to meet with her. Her opinions carried weight. Her students and admirers included members of the educated Alexandrian elite. Soon a rumor began circulating among Cyril's supporters. Hypatia, they claimed, was preventing the bishop and the prefect from reconciliation. That claim was politically useful because it transformed an institutional struggle into a story about one corrupting individual. The conflict no longer needed to be understood in all its complexity. It could be placed upon a single body, a pagan body, a female body, a philosopher who possessed influence, but no soldiers. Rumors, sadly, do not need proof. All they need is repetition. They move through a city by whispers, sermons, glances, accusations, and innuendo. They turned conversations into conspiracy, independence into arrogance, learning into sorcery, advice into manipulation. And once a human being has been converted into the supposed cause of every grievance, violence begins to present itself as a solution. In the March of the year 415, during the Christian season of Lent, Hypatia traveled through the streets of Alexandria. We do not know what occupied her thoughts that day. Perhaps a lesson, perhaps a petition from a former student, perhaps the growing danger surrounding Orestes, perhaps nothing political at all. History preserves the approach of the crowd. It does not preserve the private world of the woman they approached. According to Socrates Scholasticus, a group of Christian zealots led by a man named Peter, a reader in the church, waited for her. They violently seized Hypatia from her carriage. They dragged her into the Caesareum, a former center of imperial worship that had become a Christian church. There, they stripped her of her clothing. They killed her using broken tiles, shards, or pieces of pottery. They tore apart her body. Then they carried the remains beyond the center of the city to a place called Cinaron and burned them. The killing was not concealed in all its barbarity. It was public, ritualized, designed not merely to end life, but to erase a presence and give a warning to others such as her. The philosopher's body was destroyed in the city where her intellect had commanded attention. Socrates himself, a Christian historian, did not celebrate the murder. He wrote that it brought disgrace upon Cyril and the Alexandrian Church. Nothing he observed could be further from the spirit of Christianity than massacres. Fighting and acts of this kind were not according to the word of Christ. Later sources would tell a different story. The pagan philosopher Damascius more directly implicated Cyril, portraying him as a jealous man, jealous of Hypatia's popularity and influence inside the city. John of Nicaea, writing centuries later from a hostile Christian perspective, described Hypatia as a practitioner of magic and treated her death as a victory over paganism. These accounts reveal how quickly history became memory and how quickly memory became a weapon. Did Cyril personally order Hypatia's murder? We have no surviving evidence proving this. A serious account must not turn suspicion into certainty. But the absence of proof or a direct command does not remove the wider question of responsibility. Cyril's struggle with Orestes, the mobilization of militant supporters, the rhetoric of religious conflict, and the atmosphere of intimidation all helped create the world in which Hypatia's murder became possible. Legal guilt cannot be established from the sources. Political and moral responsibility is more difficult to dismiss. Hypatia was not murdered because she had discovered that the earth moved around the sun. There is no evidence that she made such a discovery. She was not murdered in the flames of the great library. The famous library no longer existed in its original form. She was not simply the final pagan standing against every Christian. Some of her most devoted students were Christian. She died because several dangerous forces converged upon her religious identity, upon her gender, Upon her public visibility, political influence, and urban factionalism, and the ancient human instinct to blame complexity upon one convenient enemy came to pass. The crowd did not destroy philosophy, however. Philosophy continued. Mathematics continued. Even Alexandrian scholarship continued. But it destroyed the philosopher, a woman who shaped minds. That fact is terrible enough. After Hypatia's terrible murder, the city continued. Cities nearly always survived their tragedies. Markets reopened. Ships entered the harbor. Officials issued decrees. Sermons were preached. Students found other teachers. But Alexandria had changed. The murder communicated a lesson more powerful than any law. Prestige offered no protection. Education offered no sanctuary. A citizen respected across the empire could be redefined as an enemy and destroyed in the heart of the city. In 416, imperial legislation restricted the number and activities of the Alexandrian Parabalane, a church-associated charitable body whose members cared for the sick, but also became connected with public intimidation tactics. The law limited their number and attempted to keep them away from theaters, courts, and municipal assemblies. A later law adjusted those restrictions. Neither legal text named Hypatia as the reason, but the legislation shows that the imperial government understood the deeper problem. Religious organizations in Alexandria had acquired the ability to terrify civic institutions. The law could count men. It could define offices. It could prohibit entry into a council chamber. What it could not restore was the woman who had been dragged from her carriage and murdered. Nor could it reconstruct the works that disappeared under her name. Hypatia left no surviving autobiography, no complete philosophical treatise, no collection of lectures. Her voice reaches us only indirectly, refracted through the admiration, needs and memories of others. This is one of history's great cruelties. The men who wrote about her survived in manuscripts. The woman they described survived in fragments of memory. Yet fragments can still illuminate. A title on a mathematical commentary. A former student requests an instrument. A letter beginning with affection. A Christian historian's condemnation of her murder. From these pieces, a human figure emerges. Not perfectly, but powerfully enough to resonate throughout the ages. Later centuries remade Hypatia according to their own desires. To some Enlightenment writers, she became a martyr of reason destroyed by religious fanaticism. To 19th century artists, she became a beautiful and defenseless intellectual victim. To anti-clerical polemicists, she became a weapon against the church. To feminists, she became evidence of what women had achieved even when institutions attempted to exclude them. To filmmakers and novelists, she became the last light of the classical world. Every age has created the Hypatia it required. But the historical Hypatia is more interesting than the symbol. She was not a modern atheist transported into antiquity. She was a Platonist whose philosophy reached towards the divine. She was not a solitary genius disconnected from society. She was the center of a network of teachers, students, officials, and intellectuals. She was not important only because she suffered. She was important because she taught others, because she mastered difficult disciplines, because she occupied public space with authority, because men who would themselves become powerful continued to honor her as their intellectual superior. Her murder must be remembered, but it must not be allowed to consume her entire life. When we speak only of the violence committed against the great woman, we risk allowing her killers to remain the authors of her story. Hypatia's story belongs first and foremost to Hypatia herself. And now that 16 centuries have passed since Hypatia walked through Alexandria, we look at the city she knew, which vanished beneath conquest, rebuilding, earthquake, sea and time. The lecture rooms are gone. Her scholarly works are lost or hidden anonymously within the work of others. Even her face is unknown. But the question raised by her life remains: who is permitted to speak with authority? Whose mind is cultivated? Whose work is preserved? Whose name appears on the page and whose labor disappears between its lines? Hypatia's achievement did not consist in becoming equal to the men around her. Her achievement consisted in becoming fully herself in a world that offered few models for what she became. She did not ask history for permission. She studied, she mastered, she taught, she advised. She entered the rooms where decisions were made and carried with her authority of a disciplined mind. This is why her life can still inspire others. Not because every young woman must become Hypatia. Not because greatness takes only one form. Because somewhere, today, a girl is looking forward to entering a field from which people like her were once excluded. Mathematics, science, diplomacy, defense, philosophy, administration, or leadership. She may believe that greatness belongs to other people, to different families, to different genders, to different countries, to different centuries. Hypatia's life answers otherwise. Greatness does not always arrive with an army. Sometimes it enters gently but strongly, quietly, carrying a manuscript. Sometimes it stands before a class and explains what others considered impossible. Sometimes it looks at the night sky and refuses to accept that mystery and ignorance are the same thing. Hypatia could not know what the future would make of her. She could not know that her name would outlive the prefects, mobs, and political struggles of her city. She could not know that women would one day calculate the trajectories of spacecraft, lead universities, command military formations, govern nations, and explore the structure of the universe. But every boundary crossed makes the next crossing imaginable. Every woman who enters a forbidden room leaves the door less firmly closed. And every generation must decide whether knowledge will be protected by courage or surrendered to fear. Alexandria once possessed a woman who thought its most powerful men to contemplate truth. Her city failed to protect her. History must not fail to remember her, not merely as a victim, not merely as a symbol, but as she lived, a philosopher before rulers, a teacher of future bishops, a mathematician beneath the stars, as Hypatia of Alexandria, a mind they could silence only by destroying the body that carried it, and the voice that even now has not entirely disappeared. Thank you for listening. This has been the first episode of The Great Ladies of History. The first of the great ladies, and a reminder to every generation that human mind has no rightful master but truth. I have been Alex Krishan, and this has been Realpolitik Confidential, the great ladies of history. Stay safe out there and remember our motto: less ideology, more analysis.